Okay, everyone, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed lunch. We've got 2 more sessions, and then we'll bring the day to a close. Hi, comrades, just please, your attention, thank you. Thank you, everyone, and welcome back to all those online. We're going to proceed through with our next panel. This is Lebogang Mulaisi from PCC. She'll be the discussant, and then we've got our 4 presenters from TIPS on the National Employment Vulnerability Assessment. NEVA, you can check in on your program. So I'm going to hand over to you, but I do see that people are coming in as well. So, but I think we'll proceed nonetheless. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, colleagues, comrades, thank you very much. We're going to get into a deep dive into the NEVA study. Is NEVA here?
No.
She always gets very awkward around the fact that she worked on a report that ended up being called the NEVA study. And not NEVA in the sense that, you know when you chair a commission and then your name is, it was just because someone decided that this report must be called National Employment and Vulnerability Assessment, and the acronyms just ended up being NEVA. So there's no correlation between the two, but yeah, she did a lot of hard work. So actually, we should just give this to her anyway. With that said, comrades, in the way in which our economy is shaping up, it's important for us to understand the changing nature and the landscape of our economy. We work in the economy, we operate in the economy, we organize in the economy. So whatever ends up happening to the structure of our economy very much impacts the structure of unions, union organization, and the way in which we do our work as the union. So to help us kind of understand what's happening at a sectoral level, we're going to have a couple of presentations. And I like the spread of sectors that we're covering. So we'll have someone that will speak to agriculture, coal, metals, as well as petrol-based transport. Dr. Michael, I believe you are online.
Yes, I am. Not sure if anyone can hear me.
Sure, we can hear you now. Just before you start, Michael, 2 seconds before you start.
Okay.
We're in Sandton, and I don't want to keep you here for very long. The traffic is a mess. Town planning here was not done very well. So we're going to limit, I know it said 15 minutes, but I'm going to limit each input to 12 minutes because I really want to also give a chance for the colleagues in the room to also make their inputs. These are important discussions for us to reflect on. So Dr. Michael, over to you. Your 12 minutes starts now.
I'm sure my slides are showing and not my notes. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today. So the sector that I'll be focusing on for the NEVA is the agricultural sector. Now, this presentation is part of a larger report. As you heard, I've only got 12 minutes, so I won't go into too much detail. Oopsie. So I won't go into too much detail on so I won't go into too much detail on the agri sector, but for what's important for us to understand is that the agricultural sector in South Africa is very much one that has a very diverse climate, which allows us to produce various products and crops, etc. But this also stands alongside a very divide between a globally competitive agro-industrial sector, which is competitive internationally, but this at a local level, it's also very much, we see marginalized smallholders and low paid and immobile farm workers or farm labor. And a lot of this is part of the legacy of our apartheid past and the structural inequality. And this is the sort of foundational layer on which these climate impacts are now being imposed. And we know that, and I won't go into too much detail, but we know that on the one hand, agriculture is highly exposed to climate change, but it is also a contributor to climate change. So we should sort of keep this in mind when we do deal with agriculture. And in our sector, what we do see is that more commercial farms are able to adapt to climate change, whereas smallholders and a lot of communities in the country are not as fortunate due to a lack of often financial resources. Now, in terms, just a sort of background, just to keep it short, but in the agricultural sector in 2024 funded around 840,000 people employed in the agricultural sector. Now, critically, a large portion of this workforce is very much in a precarious position with very little alternatives in the event that they do lose their jobs as a result of climate change. We see that about 40% of these farm workers are permanently employed. And I won't go into the trends in production. I'll skip along to the climate change impacts. And what we see is that these impacts are very much direct and they are severe. We've seen droughts over the years, and increasingly in the last few years, say 2023, 2024, there have been increased reports of farm losses or farms reporting losses as a result of floods and hail. And there are obviously various impacts that differ between these agricultural branches. Now, the purpose of the study was to assess the vulnerable groups within the agricultural sector. Now, we see farm workers who are at risk of losing their job in the event that climate change essentially threatens their jobs as a result of farm closures. Also, in addition to this, we also see the adoption of technologies that could also lead to job losses. But interestingly, in agriculture, there's also households in the historic labor-sending regions that are at risk of food insecurity. And we essentially, across all these studies, we analyze the vulnerability of the people in these sectors based on financial, physical, human, and social resources or capital. In terms of farm workers, they face several risks. Now, their wages tend to often be very low compared to workers outside of agriculture, or more formal workers. And in the event that they do lose their job, which the graph on the left shows, they're more likely to rely on family members. For women, this is a lot higher, in addition to relying more on child support grants. They also have limited formal savings, things like financial protection, UIF, pension funds, etc. And slightly higher among female farm workers who tend to hold temporary jobs over male farm workers. Now, this graph essentially reveals their physical vulnerability. Now, we have to understand that farm workers' housing is tied to their job. So it's tied to them living on the farm in which they work. So a climate-related job loss will definitely lead to eviction or essentially homelessness. Now, farm workers also experience greater social and economic isolation, more than other workers in other formal sectors. And this is partly due to lower education levels, even though we have seen over the years education, especially matric, has increased, but very slowly. And while their jobs and their skills are real, they are not formally recognized. And most of these jobs in agriculture are classified as elementary jobs, which essentially require no formal training. So with this, the isolation is also manifests in insecure job arrangements with weak organization, poor enforcement, low union rates as well, and receiving fewer social grants and remittances and other sort of support networks. So now we need to start thinking about going forward and adopting support for farm workers. We need to take these things into account, things like education. So it's not just simply reskilling them, it's how we do these reskilling and trying to get them alternative economic opportunities. Now, the second group, and this is the last one that I'll focus on, is the households in historic labor-sending regions. Now, these are not commercial farmers. They are households that are often, through our data, we've seen that they're often led by women that are using backyard gardens to supplement their food. We see that only around 3% of households in South Africa rely on agriculture as an income source. and medium hours ranging along about 4 hours per week. And these rates are a lot higher in the former historic labor sending regions, such as Limpopo, Eastern Cape, Mpumalanga. And their household incomes also tend to be lower, especially in traditional areas compared to urban areas. So essentially what they are doing, they are gardening because they are already vulnerable. And climate change directly threatens their food insecurity. Now, in 2024, we see more than 50% of these South African households reported salaries or wages as an income. This is a lot lower for people that are living in traditional areas that are less likely to have salaries. So as the graph shows, they rely heavily on social grants, and many of these traditional areas, we have households that are economically inactive. In addition, education levels also tend to be lower than the rest of the country. And this is largely because a lot of these traditional areas, the populations tend to be older. So just to conclude for the sake of time, so climate change, we see that it's not this sort of neutral force. It is rather how we see it in the study, it is a risk multiplier. So what we're talking about are farm workers, households that are already in a precarious position, they're already in a vulnerable position, and climate change will thus threaten either food security or joblessness. So current findings sort of point to 3 urgent policy needs. So firstly, support for farm workers have to address specific risks of housing tied to employment, seasonality of their work. A lot of farm workers are temporary or seasonal. And secondly, supporting these what we term household gardeners is a sort of direct climate adaptation and counter hunger strategy. And these are the things that the next phase of the study will start looking at. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And right on time in terms of your inputs, we're going to go into a session on coal. So Muhammed, I'm going to welcome you onto the podium.
Okay, there we go. Hi, colleagues. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to present to you today on our work, and just some contextual positioning on the NEVA papers, that are going to be presented. The formulation of NEVAs and SJRP, so what they mean are National Employment Vulnerability Assessments and Sector Job Resilience Plans, find their basis in the 2011 National Climate Change Response White Paper. And the idea is essentially employment mitigation. How can we prevent job losses as a result of climate change? And what are some of the policy approaches that we can take? So it's a 2-step framework. The first step is assessing vulnerabilities, which is what the NEVA does. And then the second step is SJRP, so formulating policy proposals on the basis of identified vulnerabilities. So that's where we're going with the various value chains and the analysis. Now, specifically on coal, coal has been the subject of scrutiny and study in terms of decarbonization and just transition, sort of from the beginning, given the carbon intensity associated with coal use, particularly around power generation, and in South Africa, petrochemicals production and liquid fuels production. So there is that historic focus, and this NEVA is essentially updating the previous NEVA that was done around 2019, 2020. There we go. Okay, cool. This slide is basically summarizes what I've just said. And before we jump into the analysis, I think it's nice to also just get a sense of the value chain. I do recall it earlier comments in some of the earlier sessions say, look, we need to look at value chains and we need to understand ripple effects and impacts, right? And when we obviously adopt a value chain approach in this analysis, and this is just a basic schematic to try and get a sense of, what we're grappling with when we talk about the core value chain. So we start off, and this data is sort of between 2020 to 2024 data to give an indication of the volume flows. So we start with around 200 megatons of coal produced. Most of that is consumed domestically by Eskom in the power stations, and through Sasol's purchases and procurement into the CTL facilities. Sasol is to some degree insulated in the sense that it owns its own coal mines, but I do understand that Sasol does procure from the open market every now and then to fill up some of the gaps. The rest domestically gets used in other industries like steel, cement, etc. Some portion is exported, around 39, 40 megatons, although, those export volumes recently have fluctuated dramatically because of issues related to infrastructure and the Transnet line from Mpumalanga to Richards Bay Coal Terminal. However, some of those volumes are starting to recover. Importantly, in the short to medium term, the coal value chain, like other energy markets, has seen a lot of volatility driven by a number of different factors. Some of the factors include COVID and the lockdowns, the subsequent economic recoveries, the Russia-Ukraine war, and the EU ban on imported Russian fossil fuels. So the result is that over the past couple of years, the demand for coal has fluctuated, and particularly around 2022, 2023, we saw a massive rise in demand for global coal. Unfortunately, South Africa wasn't fully able to capitalize on that because of our infrastructure constraints on the Richards Bay line. But that being said, even though we see these short to medium term fluctuations, based on what we see from the literature and the big sort of organizations that look at long term predictions and scenario analysis, coal is still likely to face long term declines. And I'll speak a bit more to that in the next couple of slides. Okay, so we do want to look at employment, and we can't have this analysis devoid of any employment numbers. And just to give a sense of what we're looking at, in 2024, the total coal mining estimates were around 100,000 employees nationally. High degree of concentration in Mpumalanga, about 86% of those employees in Mpumalanga. We also look at some of the main downstream consumers of coal. Eskom, and this is just looking at the direct generation linked force, right? So these are the people that work at the actual coal-fired power stations. We're looking at around 12,000. This doesn't count staff on the back end working at the head office, for example, that are involved with coal operations. Sasol, earlier number was reported around 27,000. That's the total domestic employment. This is linked specifically to coal value chain activities. So we look at around 13,000 employees. Some of these downstream consumers are key contributors to the South African economy. So, coal mining contributed about 4 billion in 2023, 2024 to the national fiscus. Sasol contributed around a similar amount as well in 2024. Importantly, and this is the case in South Africa, but in other coal regions throughout the world, coal activities are highly regionalized. So they're highly regionalized, and in South Africa, they share some of the features we see with coal regions, right? The economies are highly oriented towards the coal value chain. So coal value chain activities account for a large share of employment and gross value added in these municipalities. Also, there's a coal identity. So successive generations, your grandfather worked in coal mine, your father worked in a coal mine. There's a culture of that type of economic production that has to be accounted for as well. The key municipalities remain the same from the previous NEVA. They are Emalahleni or Witbank, Steve-Tshwete, Msukaligwa, and Govender. We've also, in this version of the NEVA, added Sasolburg, given the linkages between Secunda and Sasolburg around Sasol. Another important point is that with coal regions, because of the high degree of reliance on the coal value chain for production and economic activity, all of the allied economic activities like food services, retail, accommodation, are all dependent on the survival of the coal value chain. So if you see mass unemployment or decline in activity it has a ripple effect across these local economies. So it's not just the case that coal sits in isolation and everything else can survive around it, which has very important implications when we're thinking about declines in some of these economies. Importantly as well, the informal economy, so things like spaza shops, for example, where employers in the mines or in the power stations also support livelihoods there. Once we have an evaporation of the coal value chain, the impacts are horrendous and devastating. So in terms of some of the factors or the impacts that we considered in the analysis, when we look at global estimates of coal demand and scenario planning, so here I'm referring to, for example, the International Energy Agency or the BP Global Outlook, what we see is that the picture seems as if moving forward beyond 2030, a decline in demand for coal from Western countries and an increase in demand from Eastern countries, so countries like China, some of our existing export coal partners like India as well. However, one has to state that there's a sort of tussle between fossil fuel use in these countries and their decarbonization plans. So we know that countries like China and India have also embarked on decarbonization. So the pace of decarbonization and the extent to which those commitments are met will determine, in some part, the impact on the demand for global coal and the impact and the demand for South African coal that we export to some of these countries. We also have policies that impact the coal value chain, and there's a few of them that I've listed there. We've got the Climate Change Act, which makes provisions for carbon budgets. We've got Carbon Tax Phase 2 setting off from next year with a progressively ramping up of the carbon price. So if these measures are to be fully implemented, we're going to see heavy penalties on carbon-intensive production in the country, right? Internationally, we had a presentation on the CBAMs. Coal exports are not directly under the list of goods that are under the CBAM tax. However, we still have an coal-based electricity base that feeds into the industries that are currently taxed, and this product scope could expand in the future as well. So there's risks around that. As well. There are a number of global finance institutions that have pulled away from coal, and we see increasingly shareholder pressure on firms that are involved in carbon-heavy production, another risk. Importantly, from an equity perspective, we've seen a number of large mining conglomerates, international conglomerates, leave the South African market and leave coal and sell these assets to black-owned investors. Now, the equity argument comes in if we see a value chain, potentially a long-term risk, and the conglomerates have sort of made their money and now pulled out, and they're sort of leaving the potential long-term liability with black-owned investors. So that's another point to bear in mind. So how can we think about this? In some part, where do we see the main vulnerabilities? The main vulnerabilities essentially lie with workers, so specifically coal miners and the communities that live around the Eskom power plants and the Sasol petrochemicals plants. Some of the downstream firms can, to some extent, pivot or absorb the shock. So, for example, if Eskom were to switch to other types of generation, this could be some sort of protection measure. Sasol, from what the colleagues have presented, is already in a precarious position. You layer on heavy decarbonization penalties. Also take into account the lack of their future direction with some of the elements that have been brought out. The high capital costs associated with green hydrogen, the gas cliff story, and working out where gas supply comes from. Sasol is in a bit of a precarious position there as well. Another point about coal miners specifically, and this is also something we see across the world, is that for the level of education, they receive a higher pay compared to the rest of the formal economy. So to put that into some sort of context, coal miners earn between 12 to 15,000 rand a month. The median wage in South Africa is around 6 to 7,000 rand a month. So if those coal workers were displaced from their jobs, and they now have to enter the labor market. For their level of skills, they have to face a salary of almost about half, right? Which would have a serious impact on living standards. Thanks. Time is up. Oh, gosh, time goes by so fast when you're having fun. So you know, we detail a lot more about these impacts in the analysis. But just to say, we are moving towards the next stage of the process, which is the policy proposals. I've tried to highlight some of where the vulnerabilities lie in the coal value chain. The policy tool or the toolbox is going to be used to formulate what the appropriate policies should be on the basis of the identified vulnerabilities. And that's the next stage of the research that we're headed to. I'm not going to be selfish. I'm going to stop. We can explore some other things in the questions if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Muhammed. I'm sorry, I need to be strict on time, but you covered the important points for us to think about in the study. You know, one of the things about the NEVA study, it would be great if it came like in summarized versions, and if we separated, you know, the different sectors.
Yeah.
I think that's very useful.
Yeah.
It's a great study. It's just the information gets lost in the amounts of pages.
That is something we actually.
Thank you. I'd really appreciate that. All right, Danae, Govender. You are coming next to talk about the metal sector. Over to you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. As introduced, I'm Danae, and I will be presenting some findings from the National Employment Vulnerability Assessment for the metals value chain. Okay, so just for some context before getting into the presentation, as I'm sure we all know, that South Africa's metals value chain is under growing pressure as the shift to a low-carbon world exposes its dependence on fossil fuel-based energy. The value chain has historically relied on abundant, low-cost fossil fuels, with coal-fired electricity from Eskom being critical to operations across the value chain. Coking coal is also critical to primary steelmaking, and open-cast mines rely quite heavily on petroleum-based trucks. Now, this energy profile leaves the value chain exposed to a variety of transition-related risks, which will raise costs and limit production, potentially leading to job losses. And a failure to respond to these risks could devastate workers and communities reliant on the value chain. For additional context, the main sub-value chains considered in the assessment are platinum group metals, gold, iron and steel, chrome, manganese, and aluminium. And apart from aluminium, the value chains span mining, smelting and refining, as well as downstream manufacturing, with scrap metal also serving as an input. So in terms of the outline for this presentation regarding the metals value chain, we'll have a look at its economic contribution and employment numbers. We'll also look at its energy dependence and emissions profile. We'll then highlight the risks facing the value chain and the exposure to risks. We'll do a short assessment of the vulnerable groups, and then we'll pull out some recommendations for the sector jobs resilience plan. So in terms of the economic contribution of the metals value chain, going from left to right, for people in the audience, we see that in 2023, the sale of metal ores were over 540 billion rand. In 2024, value added from the value chain amounted to 455 billion rand, which is approximately 7% of total industry value added. And in the same year, exports across the value chain amounted to $47 billion US, which is around 42% of total exports. In terms of employment, in 2024, the metals value chain, that's both mining and manufacturing, employed 570,000 people. Now, this is down from around 850,000 in 1993, where that decline is largely due to a decline in gold mining. And in terms of proportions in each segment, the mining segment accounts for around 65% of total employment in the value chain, while metals and metal products account for around 35%. In terms of the value chain's energy dependence, as noted, the South African metal sector has historically relied on cheap fossil fuel-based energy, with coal-fired electricity, coal and petroleum being critical to operations. Regarding energy intensity, which is calculated as energy or utilities cost as a percentage of total costs, we see that in mining, energy-related costs range between 7% and 13% of costs, For some electricity-dependent smelting operations, utility costs reach 43% of production costs, and in ferroalloy production, according to reports, these costs can reach as high as 60% of production costs. The dependency is less pronounced in coal-based smelting, where energy costs are between 13 and 15%, and at the refining stage, we see that utilities account for 13% of production costs. Regarding the value chain's emissions profile, we note that the metals industry accounts for the largest share of South Africa's industrial process and product use greenhouse gas emissions at 51% in 2022, with iron and steel production and ferroalloys production being the largest contributors to the metals category. And although there's been some renewable energy uptake in the value chain with plans for further expansion, it's noted that emissions and energy intensity among entities within the value chain remains largely unchanged from 2021. Which gives rise to the following risks. The first risk that we have identified is the Climate Change Act, as mentioned by my colleague, and the associated carbon budgets. These are set to raise costs in the short term and limit production. It's going to start in 2026 with the worst of the impacts to be felt in iron and steel, as well as ferroalloys and aluminium. The carbon tax is another risk that has been identified. This too, or rather, this is already material, with costs set to mount progressively, and the adverse impacts are currently for steel making, but it could also affect electricity-dependent processes should indirect emissions be penalized as the carbon tax evolves. Rising electricity prices is another risk, and this is already material due to factors outside of the transition, but it could be fueled by the transition as proposals to ensure the price neutrality of electricity under the carbon tax runs only until the end of 2030. And this would prove particularly problematic for EAF steel, ferroalloys, and for aluminium. Another risk that was identified are rising fuel costs. This is also already material and could rise with the carbon tax. And this, even though fuel is used throughout the value chain, we've singled out open cast mines as being most vulnerable to this risk. On the demand side, we have carbon border measures, such as the EU CBAM, where penalties will be imposed from 2026. Currently, this is problematic for iron and steel, but considering that there is the potential for the CBAM to increase in both scope for both products and type of emissions, other products could be affected, and we also note that other countries are considering the implementation of similar measures. The final risk that was identified is the phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles in the EU and the UK in the 2030s, which will prove risky for the platinum group metals value chain as those metals are used in catalytic converters. So regarding exposure to risks, key factors influencing exposure include the pace of renewable energy uptake in both the national grid and by firms in the sector, as well as the advancement of the production of renewable energy, green hydrogen, fuel cells, and battery storage technologies. By segment, electricity and carbon-intensive activities such as smelting, refining, and steelmaking are highly exposed, while mining is generally less vulnerable due to lower electricity and emissions intensity. By commodity, iron and steel, ferroalloys, and aluminium are highly exposed due to high carbon intensity and electricity dependence. Platinum group metals face potential demand loss due to EV adoption in our major export destinations. And with regard to gold, the effect of climate-related pressures is unclear, but we do note that the gold is in long-term decline due to resource depletion. So regarding vulnerable groups, in terms of workers in primary steel, ferroalloy, and aluminium production face high risk in the short term. And this is because operations are energy and emissions intensive and thus exposed to transition-related pressures. In addition, workers tend to have lower financial, human, and social capital compared to those in mining. However, they are better off than the rest of the economy, and they do tend to be located in more economically diversified areas, meaning that, in theory, potentially displaced workers could find another job. Mine workers are relatively less vulnerable in the short term due to lower electricity and emissions intensity of operations, as well as due to having better financial, human, and social resources. But that does not mean that those reliant on the mining of metals are completely safe from impacts. as mining-dependent regions tend to not be economically diverse, meaning that potentially displaced workers could have a harder time finding a new job. In addition, local businesses often rely on nearby mines, so potential mine closures could adversely affect broader communities. And arguably, the worst of these effects will be felt in regions where mining and smelting are co-located. In the long term, both communities and workers dependent on the mining, smelting, and refining of PGMs are at risk due to a decline in the demand for the finished product, i.e. catalytic converters, associated with their sub-value chain. And this would be particularly problematic for Rustenburg, Moses Kotane, and Tabazimbi, as more than 40% of these municipalities' value added is from metals mining, and 40% or more of total employment is in the metals value chain. And what this implies is limited economic opportunities outside of the value chain, as well as reduced demand for businesses and employers operating in these areas. So in light of the risks and impacts outlined in this presentation, we've pulled out 3 SJRP priorities. The first is a deliberate shift to renewable energy and other low carbon technology. The second is the economic diversification of mining-dependent regions. And thirdly, we proposed the strengthening of protections for workers, including the Unemployment Insurance Fund and the...
Thank you very much, Danae. I will then, it's very difficult to have these presentations in just 12 to 15 minutes. I must just say these could have been like full inputs all on their own, but we're still trying. Nokwanda, you're going to come up and talk about petrol-based transport.
Thank you, Lebogang. Afternoon, colleagues. My name is Nokwanda Maseko. I'm a senior economist at TIPS, and my presentation will be on the petroleum-based transport value chain. Right, so in terms of the outline, the first part is the background and scope of the value chain, and then moving on to major trends and the dimensions of the impact. And as you can see from this slide, I will end with some proposals that we're looking at. So just by way of background, I think it's important to say this work is as much about emissions reduction as it is about the protection of workers or what protections workers have. And so much of what I am going to say here, as you would have seen or heard with the other presentations, is going to focus on workers rather than on actual efforts to, or how the efforts to reduce emissions is going to affect workers. So the figure here essentially shows the scope of the value chain. And so what we have focused on is automotive and components manufacturing, sales, which is vehicle and component sales, maintenance and repairs, as well as fuel retail, which is, and that includes passenger transport services, so minibus, taxis, buses, as well as road freight. And you will see, obviously, you all know that the automotive industry accounts for around 16% of global and locally. And so efforts to reduce emissions here have focused really as trying to use clean fuel, so cleaner fuel standards such as Euro 6, Euro 7, and in previous periods there was also Euro 5. The uptake of new energy vehicles in South Africa has been slow, still remains slow, less than 2%. So just in terms of the major trends economy-wise, what we're seeing is the value chain, just the segments that I've mentioned, employs around 1.4 million people as of 2024. And more than half of those are in road transport services, and then almost 20% are in repairs and maintenance. And that's important also to keep in mind, just because when you look at the structure of the value chain, these are the segments that are more likely to be informal. So because of the nature of automotive manufacturing as well as petroleum manufacturing, there are obviously standards that need to be complied with. And so much of the employment and the business that happens there is formalized, whereas in road transport, obviously taxis are more likely to be informal than formal. Same thing with repairs and maintenance. And then in terms of economic contribution, GVA in 2024 amounted to 546 billion, which is around double of what it was in 2000, and almost 2/3 of that is in land transport, and again that's road transport services. We still have a trade deficit in terms of automotive trade, but we have seen exports growing slightly faster than imports over the last few years. So imports amounted to 277 billion compared to 262 billion in 2024. And this is around a deficit of about 15 billion, which is the lowest we have seen this deficit come since 2000. And then in terms of the dimensions of the climate-related impacts, I think we've spoken about CBAM since the start of the morning. We've spoken about carbon taxes, and the impact here as it arises from carbon taxes is, at production level, there are obviously efforts to reduce emissions, which is why the carbon taxes come in and say we need to reduce emissions at production. Otherwise, you are then penalized for that. In terms of CBAM, most of the costs there are indirect. So in terms of electricity, for example, in terms of some of the steel that is used, aluminum, those types of things. And yes, we are aware that in terms of scope 2 emissions, those have been pushed back about 2 years. But I think it is important for the value chain to then start thinking about what happens once those scope 2 emissions are accounted for. There is obviously going to be that impact. And then the other one that I mentioned was around cleaner fuels. And what happens really here is that if we're going to keep exporting vehicles, especially to the European Union, at some point we will not be able to, because we are still at a lower fuel standard. Similarly, in terms of imports, what's coming in might not necessarily be as useful given our low fuel standard. I mean, some of these things are interchangeable, but obviously there are concerns around, the long-term functionality of those vehicles. And the last one, which is the key one here, I think, is the shift to NEVs. So at production level, we are aware of the fact that the EU is looking to ban imports of ICE vehicles beginning in 2035, excuse me. And while there have been some institutions saying this might be a bit too early, it does seem like at this point this is going to go ahead. And so this is one area of concern. The other thing is that in South Africa, if we do not transition to the manufacture of new energy vehicles, then we stand to lose the production that comes from, we stand to lose the production that then results in our export revenue. And as of now, we are still exporting more cars than we are consuming locally from what we are producing. And then Danae, I think, has spoken to some of the impact that would also have the shift to production of new energy vehicles, the impact that would have in terms of the metals value chain with the loss of platinum for use in catalytic converters. Right. So in terms of the nature of the vulnerability across the value chain, I think part of it really is going to depend on the timelines. And as of now, I think the one fixed timeline that we have is the 2035 ban of ICE vehicles. The rest of the timelines really are shifting. We're still seeing low uptake, obviously, in South Africa of new energy vehicles. The numbers are starting to look slightly higher globally, but these are some things that we then need to thinking about. So in terms of what the timelines mean, really, is that if you think about it, if in South Africa, like in terms of consumption, if we're moving, for example, to hybrid vehicles, let's say in the next 10 years, then that sort of shifts the sort of urgency to start thinking about the impact on let's say, petrol station workers. If we shift to hybrids first, what that means is there's still going to be some demand for petrol stations, but it will likely not be enough to maintain the more than 4,000 petrol stations that exist now. But it does sort of give us a sort of phasing period to start phasing out some of that employment and moving those workers to other areas of work. I think one thing to note, especially with the petrol station workers, when we were doing sort of the interviews, and I don't think it's changed that much, is that most of these workers, obviously, they are slightly younger, so they use the work in petrol stations as sort of a stepping stone to other jobs while they're doing something else, like getting an education, for example. So that's where the possibility to start phasing out that work is. And then in terms of the availability of the technology, obviously for road transport services, that would be important. So does the technology actually exist right now? So do we have minibus taxis? We're seeing some pilot run at this particular point, but the cost for that is still prohibitive. And in terms of buses and trucks, most of what is sold at the moment is still mostly sold in China. And so availability of the technology and the cost of that technology is going to be very important when it comes to maintaining the more than 700,000 jobs that are in that particular segment of the value chain. The other thing that we then need to think about is the impact on repairs and maintenance workers. If you go back to hybrids, for example, there are some parts of the car that mechanics can still work on. But as we shift to fully electric vehicles, those jobs are then going to start being really, really, well, that's a terrible sentence structure, apologies. But those jobs are going to be much more impacted. As we all know, electric vehicles have fewer moving parts. So those people that are going to be able to retain some jobs are those that do body work. So the spraying of the cars, for example, those that do the tire or wheel alignment. But the rest of them who are working on the actual electronics of the car are then going to be impacted. And then in terms of production, and I think it's important to point out here that employment in automotive and components manufacturing has been going down. So as of 2024, we were at around, I'm almost done. We were at around, come on, we're at around 90,000 jobs. Okay, so in terms of vulnerabilities, I think it's clear from what I've been saying, where road transport services, highly informal, has more than half of the workers in the value chain. Similarly, for mechanics, those from what we're seeing here are the most vulnerable. They're also least likely to have access to financial resources as well as trade union membership. And so I suppose one sort of question I have for the room is, what is the role of unions? How are you approaching the sort of integration of informal workers into trade union membership? And then just in terms of the proposals, I mean, these are going to largely depend on active labor market policies, so reskilling, particularly for mechanics, and then just making sure that this financing, we are still trying to look at some of the financing mechanisms for road transport services. But yeah, that's the gist of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nokwanda. You did very well. Don't worry about me. I just have a tough challenge of trying to get everyone to make their presentation and also have a chance for some sort of engagement on what has been said, because these are really rich inputs, and I really want to give the room a chance to have some reflections. So the presentations that were given give us really an insight into what the risks are in each sector. And how the presentations have been structured is that not only have they looked at the physical climate risk, but they've also looked at what the transition risk is associated with each sector. So the idea that vulnerability is isolated to the coal value chain, and as a result, mining and energy, is dispelled, because in terms of vulnerability, there's clearly vulnerability across a number of sectors, and even more than the ones that we've profiled here. So even starting in the input around agriculture, I think when it comes to particularly climate risks, this sector is quite vulnerable. Whenever there is a climate event, I mean, we don't have to look very far when we look at how this sector is particularly impacted by this. And it also points to the fact that adaptation within the sector is limited to commercial farming. So those with the big capital spend that can invest in adaptation mechanisms. So those that are engaged in small-scale farming as well as subsistence farming are then acutely exposed to particularly climate risk. But what we've also heard in the presentation is that from a transition point of view, there are clear vulnerabilities. Workers are very vulnerable. Small-scale farmers are very vulnerable. Workers particularly because they live where they work. So issues related to land tenure, as well as issues related to housing in the sector, is a clear area of vulnerability that we must pay close attention to. If you don't work on the farm, you are evicted from it. This still happens as a practice to this day. Because of the low skills level within the sector, it makes it difficult to transition those workers to other sectoral activities, particularly because of the low skills base. So really how we should be thinking about this is from the point of view that a lot of studies identify agriculture as actually a sector where labor is going to come in when we transition workers, particularly out of coal, because there's a lot of mine rehabilitation that is required after coal activities. And as a result, you know, there's vast agricultural land that's potentially available. But given the fact that the sector has serious challenges in terms of low levels of labor protection, very bad wages in the sector, low levels of wages, this is a serious thing for us to take into consideration. And I think this point has been made quite a number of times, where there's just this idea that you can take workers from one sector to another when labor standards per sector are not the same. They've not been harmonized. So these are the things as a labor movement that we should probably be thinking about. I think especially in the agricultural sector, the gendered nature of the vulnerability is something that we also need to take into consideration. Women particularly experience a specific level of vulnerability in the sector as opposed to other groups. I mean, coal, we talk about it in every session, and it's the subject of much of contested debates, and contested debates for really important reasons, because really the big impacts with regards to decarbonization and emissions reduction directly impact the coal value chain, and particularly because of issues related to electricity generation within this sector. Very happy that there was an acknowledgement that, you know, there's a difference between, you know, coal use, whether it is through it being used as an input into electricity generation as opposed to coal mining, which is then taken out of the country to various export destinations. It's keen to kind of understand what's going to happen to coal mining and for how long coal mining then remains viable. And how we pick up on this viability is, you know, some of the work, I think, Tips, you've also been looking at this, just looking at how countries are structuring their energy systems for the future. And what we've been looking at, even within the Presidential Climate Commission, is how energy planning now is linked to countries' nationally determined contributions as well as emissions reduction strategies. So that means that has an impact on the coal sector here in South Africa, particularly in terms of coal mining, because it then tells you in terms of what happens to the life of coal mining for the future. Another thing for us to also take into consideration, and I'm glad it's been highlighted here today, is the volatility within coal demand and coal prices in the country. It has a significant impact in terms of coal operations here in the country. And I think we saw quite a bit of it last year, with particularly Siriti laying off quite a number of coal workers in the sector. This also has multiplier impact and downstream impacts as well. So, and thanks for highlighting the fact that coal activity is really regionally bound. So it's bound to a particular region. We're not the only ones that experience this. This happens in various other countries that have coal activities. So we need to think about the region that is potentially going to be left devastated, and the conversation around economic diversification is probably something that's very important for us to take into consideration. Because when I was in the union, the question was, okay, I work in a dry cleaner. If you're saying that a coal-fired power station is due to be decommissioned, that has an impact on my job, because then nobody's going to afford to send their clothes for dry cleaning. And these are things that we have to think about. It's a knock-on impact that happens to other sectoral activities that are not necessarily coal in nature, but those who are in the coal sector participate in. So, for example, the allied sort of activities within the sector. So it's particularly important for us to kind of understand, but particularly when we look at the Western nations' demand for coal as opposed to Eastern demand for coal. So Eastern countries, China being the biggest one, they have set a net zero target for 2060. So what they say is that they will peak emissions in 2030, and then they will decline to carbon neutrality in 2060. That's important for us to take into consideration, particularly from a coal mining point of view. I believe India's is at 2070, who are also still going to be an important coal destination. I was hard on people's time, and now I'm the one that's talking too much. I'm almost done. So the metal values chain is actually an important sort of reflection that we also need to take into consideration. It's clearly important for us to take stock of the vulnerabilities of the sector. What is starting to happen at an industrial level is that some companies are not trusting that we will green the grid in time to avoid the impacts of CBAM. So what they're doing is that they are engaging in bilateral agreements with independent power producers to directly link onto their power source. Not too sure what that means in the long term for our economy, but ideally the case would have been that you green the grid in time so that industries can connect directly to the grid. So yes, an important thing is, yes, being able to make use of renewable energy so that, you know, especially from an energy dependence point of view, the sector doesn't continue to struggle. But this is also another sector where economic diversification is really important, so that there are other activities that workers are able to transition into. But Danae, you know, your presentation was so pessimistic. I was waiting to hear about, you know, the opportunities for critical minerals, because this has been fiercely debated in the G20 discussions, and around the future of the metals industry in light of this dividend around critical minerals. But you can respond to that when we finally open it up for questions. And then transport, petrol-based transport. So after the electricity sector, the next sector that requires deep decarbonization is the transport sector. And Nokwanda has raised really important insights around the very low uptake of EVs. Domestically, there's issues there related to the tariffs and the prices of EVs, which are still is still a subject of debate. But an important reflection is the EU bans on ICE vehicles. The EU still remains quite the biggest trading partner in this regard. And I mean, they're setting their bans from between 2030 to 2035, where 2030, there will be like a partial reduction, whereas the actual end is now the year 2035. So the need for localization of manufacturing here in South Africa of components of vehicles becomes really important. And thanks for identifying the stark vulnerability of particularly petrol attendants in the sector. But there's another vulnerability that we don't take into consideration because these workers are informal in nature, but your informal mechanics who are fixing cars, because EVs in nature do not require that much maintenance, they don't have that many parts, it then decreases the need for ongoing maintenance and fixing of cars. So this has a significant impact on that particular sector, something for us to take into consideration. So job opportunities are in local manufacturing, and I see there's a lot of conversation also about e-fuels for transport. There's just a recognition that electrifying cars or the vehicle fleets is not necessarily the single solution here in South Africa. There's an opportunity for e-fuels, particularly for long distance freight. And this is probably another opportunity for there to be job creation, especially while we're still meeting our decarbonization goals. I'm going to leave it there as a summary and then open it up for questions to our various panel members. Thank you. Are there questions? Please do raise hands. Lisa, I see you burning to say something, so you might as well while we're waiting for more questions. So Lisa would like to say something. Let's start with her. Oh yeah, Lisa, if you could introduce yourself and then say who the question is for.
Okay, well, no, my name is Lisa Seftel. I'm going to be the facilitator in the next discussion. I wanted to make a comment, not a question, but you could respond to it. But I think it's more a methodological problem, maybe related to the NEVA, which stands for the National Employment Vulnerability Assessment. And I suppose because you are looking at vulnerability, you are not able to simultaneously look at opportunities. And that leads to, I think, the point that Lebo made is that it sounds very depressing. And in front of a trade union audience, when all we hear is vulnerability, you know, I think there's something, you know, and maybe you will correct it when you look at the sector job resilience plans, but it shouldn't only be about job resilience plans, it should be about new job opportunities. Because, you know, for trade unions, and we talked earlier on about the need to go for collective bargaining, you want to be able to bargain not only to save jobs, but to build new jobs, which are decent jobs. So that really was the comment that I was wanting to make. Thanks.
Sure. I want to check, are there any more questions? I'm going to allow for the awkward silence to happen, and then someone is going to be forced to have to ask a question.
Go back.
I'm just checking first before we can. Nothing. There we go. I love the awkward silence. I'm going to start there, and then we'll come to you.
Hi, thanks. My name is Landi Mashlan. I just wanted to check if I heard it correctly, just on the petrol-based transport presentation. Did I hear correctly to say that I'm not sure whether the number of petrol stations, I thought I had 4,000. I thought maybe there may be more than that. But maybe a substantive question is, I'm getting a sense that because of the age profile of the petrol attendants, them being young, therefore somewhat the implication seems to be saying that they may just because they're using their work at the petrol station as as a stepping stone, they might find some opportunities somewhere should, for instance, the if you like, the climate change take hold. I'm not sure whether with the record not so good about hiring young people in this country, is something that probably or is there some insight that we think probably we could change that situation? Because I think for me, and at least if I take the current trends as anything to go by, it looks like we are even struggling to create jobs for those young people, in some instances, even those that are actually are graduates. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question over here.
Hunter. Warren McGregor from the Global Labour University at Wits. To address the challenges and perhaps then also to take advantage of the opportunities, which may look at everything from research and analysis to reskilling, etc., I think implies a much more interventionist or activist state. The current state, well, the dominant policies or the dominant ideological framework, which GAIN just released a few months ago, does not actually challenge, just reiterates again the market, private market in particular, as the driver for development, and also, as GAIN makes reference to, the driver of a just transition. So, despite the fact that there may be opportunities, it implies, number one, not just an activist state, but it also relies on the ability for the state to be able to be interventionist or activist. And after decades of patronage politics, the corrupting of state capacities, what opportunity is there for, despite the opportunities, for South Africa to actually take advantage of whatever opportunities are on the table? And then, too importantly, what role then for trade unions within this particular context? Thanks.
Thank you very much. I just want to check if there are any more. We're not going to open up another round, so I'm gonna, okay, 2 more, and then we can, oh wait, I also do see an online question. We're just going to take the 2 more here physically, and then we'll go to the online audience.
It's Rod Crompton. I was on the panel this morning. Just a quick question, a quick comment on that petrol stations question. You may not know that South Africa's biggest and most expensive job creation program is petrol stations. They're heavily subsidized by motorists through the petrol price and the way it's regulated. But the interesting thing, and that's the lesson out of this for the just transition, is that despite all this money that we pump into it, we don't know how many jobs are created, and we don't know how many petrol stations there are.
Sure.
So that's something to think about when you think about funding the just transition. Is monitoring and evaluation is missing in that job creation program.
Thank you. And then the last one.
Yeah, Annie Subru. I'm just reiterating what a couple of people have said, especially Lisa. The just transition opens the way for a new paradigm. The old paradigm was easy to do. We dug up coal, we made power, we used it. It's no longer going to be like that. We're going to require an awful lot more people to be involved in the just energy transition than were in the old form of power and other value chains. It's expansive. It's not reductionist. It's going to grow things. And what really excites me, as a person who does a lot of work on women economic empowerment, is the opportunity for women in this just energy transition, because they will be able to take their place where they're completely excluded almost now, because the jobs were given to other people who had different skills and strengths and things like that. So I think I would prefer if we took, I've been working on the green economy since the year 2000, started a whole project called EcoCity, where we created hundreds of jobs for people doing recycling, sustainable agriculture, paper making from waste paper and reeds, eco building with all kinds of things. And it created jobs. It's not something that reduces our economy. It's something that should expand it and expand job creation. So I'm really excited by this conversation.
Very much. Bongani, can we take your question and then
Thank you, Chair of the session. I'm just going to be brief. In terms of
I have a
my
feeling, Bongani, I have a feeling there's an inside joke I'm not privy to, and that there's a belief that you won't be brief.
I'll try, Liv. Putting me on the spot here, my lives. But now, nevertheless, to Dr. Michael, just transition in agriculture must be inclusive and socially grounded, and must guard the climate resilience. That it does not come at a cost of social exclusion. You know, what are the gender impacts? Because I couldn't find any on your presentation. I know you were limited to 12 minutes. Perhaps maybe you could have expanded to the gender impacts of crop failures and climate shocks in farming household, and how are they going to be addressed? And then lastly, what models, if any, were identified by your study could or have a potential to reach marginalized farming communities, and not just commercial agriculture businesses? I submit. I hope I was brief.
You were perfect. Thanks. Thanks. You've been getting a round of applause in the Bongani, I understand you attended a lot of my climate change committee meetings. If it was just our meetings, I'd let you go on and on. All right. I'm going to hand it over for comments as well as responses. Lev, how are we looking for time?
Look better.
Okay, we're not looking too good right now. So what we'll do is this. Please respond to the question and then also do your summary and wrap up, and then we'll close off the panel. Can I start with you, Michael?
No problem. Thanks, Bongani. I completely agree with the notion that when we look at this just transition, we shouldn't just look at it from a sort of emissions reductions perspective. It needs to be one that is socially inclusive, especially when we look at these vulnerable groups. As for the gendered question, unfortunately, didn't have time to go into all the small details, but the report will include gendered perspectives as well. But what we have found, and just briefly, is that on all levels of the, whether it be social capital, human capital, physical capital, women did tend to fare off a lot worse than female farm work. Female farm workers fared a lot worse than male farm workers, and the same goes for the household heads as well. But we do go into detail on that in the report. In terms of the models, the whole purpose of this update was to look at who is vulnerable and are they still vulnerable. And the next phase with the SGRPs, and then we're also doing a couple of deep dives in agriculture related to adaptation, and then also active labor market policies. We are looking at what do we do to support these vulnerable groups. So for this phase of the study, for agriculture, we did not look at what models are available to sort of solve these issues, especially at the smallholder level, and then also the household level in traditional areas and so forth. So yeah, so hope that answers your question. Thanks.
Let's go straight to you.
Okay, I'll pick up the two questions. So one is on the pessimistic nature maybe of the presentations, and unfortunately, you know, as I explained in my presentation, the NEVA SGRP is a two-step framework. You know, the first part is looking at vulnerabilities, and unfortunately that is looking at the depressing stories, right? So who are the workers and the communities and the vulnerable stakeholders in general most at risk? And what are some of the adverse potential impacts that we see coming up on the horizon that are going to exacerbate the situation? The presentation on SJRPs, I can assure you, is going to be a bit more upbeat because really it's there now where we explore the policy solutions, right? Where are the opportunities? What are the mechanisms and policy tools that we can use to harness those opportunities? And ultimately, how do we end up in a position? Ultimately, when we think about just transition, it's not just about mitigating impacts on the vulnerable, but we want the vulnerable to be left off in a better position after the transition. And that's essentially the philosophy that we take when we approach the policy assessment. So I hope that we can give a bit more upbeat, SJRP presentation. The vulnerability assessment, by its nature, is looking at vulnerabilities. Then the second was around, state intervention or the role of the state. Ultimately, there has to be a coordination role that's played by someone. Without that coordination role, either we end up with outcomes that are suboptimal. The employment situation worsens, the inequality situation worsens, and we just carry on. Or stakeholders here and there, do their own part in an uncoordinated way, and you have different shades of interventions. So yes, the state has a key role to play in all of this, and a coordinating role to play in all of this, in mobilizing the resources, in setting the policy agenda. Can the fiscus bear all the costs for the interventions? It's not clear. We are obviously in a constrained situation. We have other initiatives with foreign donors like the Jtlc, etc. So, from a resource support perspective, it may be the case that the state can't afford it all, but there is certainly a strong coordination role and overall unifying role that the state has to play. So that's just my 2 comments in parting text.
Sure. Not to copy and paste Muhammad's response regarding the SJRPs, but we will unpack a slightly more optimistic picture there. I did touch on it slightly in this presentation with regard to the exposure to risks, where I mentioned that among the key factors influencing exposure is our ability to manufacture renewable energy technology, how fast we can advance green hydrogen technology, fuel cells, as well as battery manganese, which would all sort of, both for domestic use and for export, which would all sort of mitigate the vulnerabilities faced in the value chain. But we'll elaborate a bit more on the SJRPs.
Yeah, all right. On the petrol stations, I think, yeah, so I did say that there's more than 4,000, but I think we're looking at around like 4,600 or slightly less. And most of those are franchisees of the major petroleum refineries, except for like a handful that are coming out now. Some of them you would have seen, like Puma. I can't remember the names of the other ones. And I think on the issue of gender, for me, what it points to is just the nature of South Africa's industrial policy and the reliance on sort of coal generation and heavy industry. What it does mean is that it does not create that many opportunities for women. Where you see women is in retail services, for example. It's where the state is the bigger employer, so like education, healthcare, those types of places. Whereas in terms of this, these industries that we're looking at, except for agriculture, generally these don't hire women. So there's like less than, I think, 15% of women in the petroleum-based value chain. So those are some of the things that we need to think about. And then just in terms of the labor question, I think I would like to go back to what I was saying earlier about the role of labor. When you look at sort of the informal industries that are mentioned as part of the presentation, what does labor see as its role in terms of expanding the protection that labor unions provide to workers in the informal sector? Because they do need that protection from the sort of collective bargaining. But whether there's enough that trade unions are doing in terms of bringing those workers in? I think that's a question for Labour to answer. Yeah.
It's on what the labor movement needs to do. I was in hot water for saying this at some point, but the way in which we organize as a labor movement is also going to be challenged by this transition, right? So vulnerabilities exist, yes, but there's a difference in vulnerability between formal employees and those that are not formal. So the contract workers at Eskom, when Komati was decommissioning, were immediately thrown out of the system, whereas there was protection for formal workers. It's areas like that that is an avenue for the labor movement to increase its base by effectively organizing these workers. They are workers nonetheless, whether they are contract workers, formal, non-formal, they remain workers nonetheless. And I think the important thing here, and I know union constitutions are sometimes very difficult to amend, but really thinking around how we get workers who are not necessarily able to give us subs every month, but you can continue to represent them, organize and represent their best needs. So thanks for raising that as something for the trade unions to think about, because that's the only way that we're going to win, especially in terms of providing sufficient protection to workers. That's the end of our panel discussion. Thank you very much, colleagues.